So now we know how drug testing in principle is conducted. And of course, it works, else we would hardly do it. Right? So let's probe into why it actually works and what kinds of guarantees we get. So the setting is as follows. Remember that we have a double-blind sample. One group of patients is given the drug, one group is given a sugar pill or a placebo. We track the incidence of problems reported by each group. We get Bernoulli trials. Out of this, we construct a discrepancy in the relative frequency of problems in one group vis-à-vis the relative frequency of problems in the other group. We have a discrepancy delta. Bear in mind that once we've collected the data, we know this number delta. It's chance-driven. Each time we do the experiment, we're going to get a different number. But for our experiment, we know delta. Our question is the following. Is this observed discrepancy larger than we would expect from just natural random variation if the drug were actually really safe? And now we have a principled basis for a statistical test. We've seen something like this when we discussed the hot hand in basketball. So, without further ado, what is the idea? We assess the likelihood of the observed discrepancy delta, the known delta, assuming the drug were truly harmless. If the drug were truly harmless, would we get such a delta by just chance fluctuation? And we do this by comparison with a thought experiment, or in the German, a Gedanken experiment, where we consider what would happen if we had a double-blind, double sample of patients, both of whom are given a placebo. In other words, if the drug were harmless, then as far as health complications are concerned, it behaves just like a sugar pill. It's as if we gave both groups of patients sugar pills. Why don't we assess what would happen in this thought experiment if we gave two groups of patients sugar pills and ask, what are the chances that the discrepancy there is larger than the observed discrepancy delta? And this will then lead us to a principled idea of how it's going to work. So let's start. The Gedanken experiment, the thought experiment, consists of generating, in principle, a double sample of patients, split double-blind into two groups. In each group is given placebos. The first group reports health complications according to a sequence of Bernoulli trials. Let's call them X1 through Xn. The second group, in principle, reports health problems according to Bernoulli trials X1 prime through Xn prime. Since both groups are being given these sugar pills, they are both governed by the same Bernoulli parameter P, which we do not know. Right? This is the probability of occurrence of health complications in the patient pool if they're not given anything, if they're given a sugar pill. From here, we directly figure out how many patients were affected in the first group, call that S sub n, the number of complications in that group, and the number of complications in the second group, call it S sub n prime. And we of course know that by adding Bernoulli trials, we are going to get binomial distributed variables. So both Sn and Sn prime are binomially distributed with parameters n, the number of trials, and p, the success probability. Bear in mind that we do not know p, but we do know n. N is a number in the sample, but p is the unknown rate at which complications occur in the general population if they're not given treatment. Okay, what is the key idea? Ask, how likely is it that the difference in the relative frequencies in the first group given the placebo and the second group given the placebo are in excess of the observed discrepancy of the test done in practice? So let's put some mathematical window dressing around this, dress it up so that we can focus clearly on what it is that we want to calculate. We want to evaluate the probability that the difference on the relative frequencies of incidence in the two placebo groups in absolute value exceeds the observed discrepancy delta in the experiment that was actually done in our clinical trial. So this is what we want to evaluate. We should immediately pause, take stock, and get our minds around what the chance experiment really is. What is the sample space? Well, naturally enough, the sample space is a 2n tuple of ones and zeros, 2n Bernoulli trials. Okay? What is the probability measure? Oh, it's going to be engendered by just multiplying p's and q's because of independent trials. And what is the event at hand? Well, it is informed by Sn and Sn prime. Let's focus on exactly what that means by simplifying our fractions. Clear the denominator by multiplying all the terms by n, and we find that this is equivalent to the statement that we want to evaluate the probability that the number of occurrences in the first placebo group differs from the number of occurrences in the second placebo group in absolute value by n times delta, the observed discrepancy, or more. Okay, now we've got this concrete object to wrap our heads around. Let's put this down, examine it, and say, well, okay, here's what we've got. How do we go about computing it? The event at hand is determined by the difference between the accumulated sum Sn and Sn prime. So let's focus on this. Now, both Sn and Sn prime are chance-driven, but we know that they are binomially distributed variables. Of course, we know the n, and we know there's a hidden but fixed p underlying all of this. So they are binomially distributed with parameters n and p. And of course, we know that the expected value of these binomial distributions is exactly n times p. And so a happy thought strikes us. Sn and Sn prime are chance-driven, but we know that we expect each of them to concentrate around the center, around n times p. Why don't we simply compare each of them to n times p? Well, say look at Sn minus Sn prime, and by the simple expedient of adding and subtracting n times p and grouping terms, we now have two terms on the right. Each term in the round brackets is a comparison of a binomial with its expected value. And we know a great deal about these, don't we? Right. Let's simplify things just a little bit further. On the right, we have two terms. In round brackets, a term, let's call it a for simplicity, and in round brackets, a term, let's call it b. And so we have the absolute value of a minus b. But elementary algebra tells us that the absolute value of a minus b is no larger than the absolute value of a plus the absolute value of b. This is what we call the triangle inequality. If we want to appeal to geometry, this is just a statement that two sides of a triangle are larger than the third. Okay, with this identification of a and b, we can see immediately that the desired absolute value of a difference is bounded above by a sum of two differences, Sn minus np and Sn prime minus np. Of course, now we want the probability the object on the left exceeds epsilon. But this engenders a new principle, right? On the left, we want Sn minus Sn prime, an absolute value, to exceed a certain quantity. This is the event at hand. Let's use a's and b's to simplify our notation for the time being. We want the absolute value of a minus b to be larger than the absolute value of c for some positive c. Good. But if a minus b in absolute value is to exceed the absolute value of c, then it perforce forces at least one of two inequalities to be true. That either a in absolute value has to be bigger than c in absolute value over 2, or b in absolute value has to exceed c in absolute value over 2, or perhaps both. Why? If both the conditions on the right were violated, if a was smaller than c over 2 and b was smaller than c over 2, then the difference of a and b in absolute value could not possibly exceed c. And so the condition on the left implies the occurrence of at least one of the two conditions on the right. Right? Let's write it out now in words, identifying our A and our B and our C. If the event that Sn minus Sn prime in absolute value exceeds n delta is to occur, then at least one of the two events, Sn minus Np in absolute value exceeds n delta over 2, or Sn prime minus Np in absolute value exceeds n delta over 2. At least one of those two events has to occur. The occurrence of the event on the left implies the occurrence of at least one of the two events on the right. Or, yet again, if you want to describe it mathematically, the event on the left is a set, and that set is contained in the union of the two events on the right. Now we've come to a right understanding of the event at hand. Almost over, bother shouting. Let's assemble everything together.